Okay, so now we're going to talk about classification and evidence of evolution. So taxonomy is another word for classification. So taxonomy is a branch of biology that specializes in classifying organisms into a series of groups. Those groups are called taxa. Okay, so for example, a kingdom is a taxa. A domain is a taxa. A family is a taxa. And so we're going to talk about some of the taxa. Anyway, so I want to introduce the three domain system to you. So most of the time you learn kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. But I do want to introduce domain to you. Domains are larger than the kingdoms. Okay, it's the largest taxon. And so there's three domains. There's bacteria. Bacteria include only the kingdom Eubacteria. Okay, then you have Archaea domain, which includes only the kingdom Archaea or Archaebacteria. Then you have Eukarya, which is going to be all eukaryotic kingdoms, which are protists, plants, animals, and fungi. Okay, so anyway, the Eubacteria and Archaebacteria kingdoms used to be one kingdom called Monera. Now they are separate kingdoms, okay, and they're also separate domains. Okay, so Aristotle, he lived a very long time ago. Anyway, he was the first person to classify organisms into plants and animals. So he categorized organisms as plants and animals, and he was the first person to do that we know of. Then we skip a long period of time, and we have this guy named Carolus Linnaeus, or a lot of the times they call him Carl, okay, just Carl. So this is Linnaeus. So Linnaeus is the father of taxonomy. He's considered the father of taxonomy because he created these groups, these taxa. Okay, the plural is taxa, singular is taxon. Anyway, so these groups, so like a kingdom is one taxa, a species is one taxa. Anyway, so in creating these groups, he organized living things based on their similarities. Now, we still use his system today. So another guy named Carl Woese, we mentioned him before in the previous PowerPoint. In 77, he conducted molecular studies of ribosomal RNA. And that ribosomal RNA showed different gene sequences for bacteria. So this is when bacteria were split into two separate kingdoms. Used to, all of the bacteria were in one kingdom called Monera. Okay, so before he did this research on this ribosomal RNA in the bacteria, they didn't know that there were such differences. So now you have two separate kingdoms of bacteria, Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. And that leads us to the three domain system. So domain is the largest, highest taxonomic category. It is larger than a kingdom. And there are three domains, Archaea, Eubacteria, and Eukarya. So Archaea only includes the kingdom Archaebacteria. Eubacteria only includes the kingdom Eubacteria. But the domain Eukarya includes all eukaryotic organisms, which includes plants, animals, the kingdoms, Plantae, Animalia, Protista, and fungi. Classification of the diversity of species is studied by who? Evolutionist, taxonomist, theorist, or taxidermist? Hopefully you picked taxonomist. Okay, so the Carolus Linnaeus, Carl Linnaeus classification system is known as Linnaean classification. Okay, so a lot of people learn a mnemonic, okay, to remember this. It is kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, there's lots of mnemonics you could do. A lot of people say King Philip or Katy Perry came over for, could be great spaghetti, grape soda. I mean, you could really replace these words however you want. But anyway, most people use what we call a mnemonic to remember this. And domain would be above this. So you could say, Dear Katy Perry. But anyway, so they go in order. And so like a kingdom, K, Katy, is going to be made up of all the ones below it. Okay, so kingdoms are made of phylums. So it's a group of phyla. A phylum is made up of the next taxon, a group of classes. Okay, so here's phylum, here's class, and then order. So a class is made up of orders. An order is made up of families, and so on and so forth. So the definitions of kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species are based on what they're made of. So a kingdom is it's going to be the largest taxon if you're not including domain. Sometimes they include domain, sometimes they don't. Because it's the largest, it includes the most organisms. Okay, so for example, kingdom Animalia includes all insects, all soft-bodied animals, all mammals, all vertebrates. Okay, that's lots of animals. But the species, or the genus and species Homo sapiens, includes only the humans. So a kingdom is going to have a lot more organisms than just the genus or species, for example. So as you go up, you get more and more organisms, more broad. As you go down, closer to species, you become more specific. So here are your 6 kingdoms. Plantae, Animalia, fungi, Protista, which are all eukaryotic. Okay, got your eukaryotics there. And then your prokaryotics are your bacteria, archaebacteria and eubacteria. Remember, bacteria, prokaryotic cells, the only example is bacteria. Okay, so then you have order, which is group of families. Family is a group of genuses, or genera is the plural for genus. And then genus is a group of species, okay, and they're all related. Now, species is considered the smallest, okay, it's the most specific. Okay, and it has the least number of organisms. So remember, the definition of a species is they must be able to interbreed and produce fertile offspring. A group of related organisms that are able to interbreed in nature and produce fertile offspring is a species. We just talked about that. The taxonomic group that shows the greatest similarity among its members is the, greatest similarity. Okay, that's most specific. It's going to be species. Which statement describes organisms that are classified in the same genus? Okay, so kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. If this is the same, if the genus is the same, what do you know? Okay, so everything above it must be the same. Okay, so they must have the same kingdom, phylum, class, order, and family. Now, if the genus is the same, they can have a different species. So your answer is going to be A. They must be in the same phylum, that will be here, but they may be a different species, that will be here. As we move through the taxonomic groups from the kingdom to species level, organisms, as you get closer to species, they're going to become more similar. Which of these taxonomic classification groups has the fewest members? Again, back to what I was saying earlier with animals. Animals are going to have the largest amount. That's the kingdom. Okay, as you go down the line, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, you're getting a smaller and smaller number. So it's going to be species with the fewest. Okay, so this is a great picture of what I was talking about here. Okay, so you have your kingdom, your phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. Okay, and you have the number. So kingdom Animalia has over 1 million species. Okay, the phylum Chordata has about 40,000 species. The class Aves, which are birds, has 8,700 species. So you notice your number is decreasing, okay, as you go through the levels. But it's also becoming more specific. We went from all animals to now we're talking about birds. Now we're specifically talking about songbirds. Then songbirds that are also wood warblers. And then specifically the genus. Now here's the scientific name. which includes the genus, which is Dendroica, and the species, okay? And so as you notice, it becomes more and more specific. They become more and more similar, and you get less and less organisms. If an organism is in the same phylum, they have to be in the same kingdom, okay? So if whatever kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, okay? So it's got to be, so if it's in the same family, that's here. Everything above it has to be in the same, okay? So for example, if I went back to that picture, that family was wood warblers. Those birds that are wood warblers. Okay, so they'd be in the same order, the songbirds, same class, which was aves, which are birds. The phylum was Chordata, the kingdom was animals. That was that picture we just looked at. So the family, if they're in the same family, they got to still be a bird, so they're going to be in that class. Does that make sense? It's not going to be a plant. It's not going to be a different taxon. Now, after that gets more specific, so it could be in a different genus and species. All right, so naming organisms. So I just showed you the scientific name on that picture we looked at. So how you get the scientific name is using both the genus and the species. Now, the genus is always written first. It is also capitalized. The species is written second, and it is lowercase. And they are usually written in italics. Okay, so this scientific naming process is called binomial nomenclature. So bi means two, and nomen or nome means name. Okay, so this is the two-name naming system to identify an organism. Okay, so that the two names are the genus and species. Carolus Linnaeus, again, he is the person who gave us this. This is why he's called the father of taxonomy. So not only did he group organisms, he also helped us come up with a naming system for them. So this is a scientific naming system, and the reason why we use this scientific naming system is because it's a universal scientific language. Okay, so if I speak English, and I'm writing a paper on those wood warblers, that specific species of the bird. Okay, and someone in a different country that speaks a different language, maybe they speak Spanish, I can't just say these type of birds. Okay, I can't use the common name because like a dog in Spanish is, I believe, perro, and a cat is gato. So because there's so many different languages in the world, this is a scientific language that can be used worldwide. So an example of binomial nomenclature is Acer rubrum. Okay, so I know Acer is my genus because it's capitalized and written first, and I know rubrum is my species because it is lowercase and written second. Okay, so make sure you can identify the genus and species if given the scientific name. So the scientific name for the fruit fly is the Drosophila melanogaster. So the word Drosophila refers to what taxonomic group? Okay, so hopefully you recall that is the genus because it is written first and capitalized. Scientists use a two-name naming method of providing scientific names to organisms. That's called, remember, two-name binomial nomenclature. Okay, so binomial nomenclature, and that was Carolus Linnaeus that came. The scientific name of an organism, does it vary accordingly to the native language of scientists? The same for scientists all over the world, may refer to more than one species, or is different for scientists all over the world. So we're talking about the scientific name, not the common name, so it should be the same for scientists all over the world. Okay, so here is the classification of an earthworm. Okay, so this earthworm is in the kingdom Animalia, the phylum Annelida, the class Aligchata, the order Upstipora, the family Lumbricae, genus Lumbricus, and there's my genus again with my scientific name, and my species is Terrestris. Okay, so this is just showing how you would classify this organism. Now, you're not magically going to know this. Okay, you would be given this, and then you maybe would be asked to identify what order they're in or something. Now, there is also something called trinomial nomenclature. So just like you would think, it is 3 names. Okay, so this is when you have a subspecies. That third name is a subspecies or a variety. Okay, so your first 2 names are still going to be your genus first, your species second, but that third name is going to be the subspecies or variety. So one example is this long, crazy word, Haliaetus leucocephalus washingtonensis. So the H word is the genus, the L word is the species, and then that third one is going to be my subspecies. So if you think about dogs, which are canines, dogs and wolves are actually considered the same species. They are just different subspecies of each other. So there's different types of dogs. You know, there's like a regular different breeds of dog that we have. There's also like a dingo dog that they believe they live in Australia. There's different subspecies of wolves. So those are all subspecies of the same species. The language of scientific names is, now this is something we haven't talked about yet, but we're going to talk about it now, because better to see it now than on your test, right? So the language of scientific naming is going to be Latin, okay? And that's because it's not really a spoken language anymore. Of the following, Felis leo is most closely related to. Okay, so Felis and Felis, so they have the genus in common, right? So they are closely related. They're most closely related by genus. None of these have the same species. The genus must be in common for it to be related. Okay, if the species is the same, for example, Acer rubrum, okay, and Acer saccharum, that's a red maple and a sugar maple. Okay, so they're maple trees, so they're related. But if you take Acer rubrum and Rana rubrum, okay, the rubrums are the same. Rubrum just means red. This is a red maple. This is a red frog. We know frogs and trees are not related, okay? And genuses, you would have to have the genus in common for it to be related. Scientific names tell you if 2 organisms are closely related. So what I was just saying, if you have Acer rubrum and Rana rubrum, they're not going to be closely related because they do not have the same genus. But if they do have the same genus, as in Acer rubrum and Acer saccharum, then they are closely related. Scientific names come from the taxonomic groups what? Remember that's binomial nomenclature? So hopefully you pick genus and species. The red maple tree is known by the scientific name Acer rubrum. The sugar maple tree is known as Acer saccharum. What is the smallest classification division these trees have in common? Well, that's going to be the Acer, and hopefully you recall that is genus because it's written first and capitalized. It's easy to group snakes based on color. However, a scientist would prefer a system that shows how snakes okay, so that would be genetically related. Genetics are always, DNA is always the best way to see how closely things are related, and we'll be talking about that soon. So, if you find an unknown organism, we do have a way to name them if they've already been identified before. So the best way is to look at DNA comparisons, like I just said. Okay, I can look at the nucleotide sequence, so like A, C, G, T, sorry about my handwriting, T, A, T. Okay, so if organism 1, this is their nucleotide sequence, organism 2, and then organism 3, I can see which 2 are more closely related, which will be these 2, because they only have 1 letter off. Okay, now, so the way that we can name organisms, if we don't know what it is, and we need to name the organism, figure out what it is, we can use something called a dichotomous key. Sometimes there's an A here, sometimes there's not. So a dichotomous key is a list of questions that leads you to the organism's name. Now, if you are naming more than one organism, you have to start back at question 1, okay? So this is an example of a dichotomous key, okay? So if you notice, there's 3 questions here, and here are your scientific names over here. Okay, and depending on how you answer the question, there's 4 birds, 4 names. So depending on how you answer each question, depends on what the bird is, okay? So, take that away. All right, so for example, you will always start at number 1. And number 1, it's either going to be 1A or 1B. Either the beak is going to be long and slender, or it's going to be stout and heavy. It can't be both, okay? So, we're going to start with, let's see, what bird do we want to start with? Let's start with bird Y. No, bird W. Okay, so bird W is, so starting at 1, is the beak long and slender or stout and heavy? Okay, I would say that's a long beak and a little more on the slender side. So that bird is going to be this name. Okay, so that would be the scientific name. Sorry, it's blurry. For that bird. Okay, let's look at bird Z. Again, starting at 1 because I started with a new organism. The beak is long and slender or stout and heavy? Okay, well, I would consider that a more stout and heavy. Okay, so I would go to 2. Okay, none of the other beaks are going to be considered stout and heavy because the only one, I'm sorry, long and slender. Because the only bird that's long and slender is going to be this one. We've already used that name. Stout and heavy. So now I go to number 2. So number 2, either the bottom surface of the lower beak, so that's here, is either going to be flat and straight or curved. Okay? So that bottom surface, bottom surface of the lower beak, I would consider that as more curved. Okay, so you're going to go to 3. Okay, and then number 3, the lower edge of the upper beak, that would be here, has a distinct bend or mostly flat. Well, that has a distinct bend, so that's going to be this bird. And sometimes you have to compare birds, one bird to another, in the in your diagram, which you're looking at. Okay, so it's not always just super easy to tell, and you would need to compare. Okay, so now I have 2 names left, so I know my other 2 birds are going to be one of those 2. Okay, so anyway, if we look at, let's look at bird X. Is the beak long and slender, stout and heavy? Okay, so I would say stout and heavy, so we're going to go to 2. The bottom surface of the lower beak, that's this, is definitely curved, so I'm going to go to 3. And the lower edge of the upper beak, I would say that's perfectly straight, mostly flat, so that would be Platyspiza. And then that leaves us bird Y. I'm going to double check with bird Y here. Make sure I can't just put the last one, because what if I got one wrong? I need to double check myself. So bird Y, that I would say this is a stout and heavy beak, so go to 2. Bottom surface of the lower beak is going to be, this one I would say is the flattest and straightest for sure. So if I compare this, the bottom of this beak, to the others, I would say this one is the most flat and straight, and so that's really what you have to do here. And this one is this one here was the longest for sure and slender. So this other one is Geospiza. So sometimes you have to compare them. Most of the time you don't, and anything I put on your test will be pretty clear what the answer is. That brings us to the 6 kingdom classification system. So as I mentioned before, there are 6 kingdoms. The 2 bacteria kingdoms used to be combined to be kingdom Monera. Now they are Archaebacteria and Eubacteria. And then you have your protists, which is kingdom Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. And remember, these are all eukaryotic. And your bacterias are going to be prokaryotic. Remember, prokaryotic cells have no nucleus, no organelles. Eukaryotic cells have a nucleus and organelles. Okay, so this is just another picture showing the classification of animals. So kingdom Animalia can be divided into vertebrates and invertebrates. Okay, so those would be phyla. And so you have all these different phyla of organisms. So echinoderms is one phyla. Annelida is one phyla. And anyway, so there's lots of other phyla. So kingdom Monera, again, these are bacteria, so they're prokaryotic. Remember, our only example of prokaryotic cells are bacteria. So now these are divided into archaebacteria and eubacteria, but they do have some similarities. All kingdom Monera, or all bacteria, are prokaryotic. Okay, they reproduce through binary fission. Okay, so they do not have a nucleus, so they lack a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles, and because they don't have a nucleus, their DNA is floating in the cytoplasm. They usually are going to contain a cell wall. These are the most widespread and numerous organisms on Earth. That means you have more in numerous would be more in number than any other organism, and they're the most widespread, meaning they can live in almost any environment. So this is an example of a prokaryotic cell, and you've seen this before. So kingdom archaebacteria. So this is specific to archaebacteria. When I think archae, I think like archaic, okay, or like very old, okay. So these are what they think is some of the oldest living things on Earth. Okay, so they think they're the oldest living bacteria. So one main difference between when comparing them to eubacteria is their cell wall is not made of something called peptidoglycan, whereas eubacteria are. Their genes, their DNA, is more similar to eukaryotic cells than the other type of bacteria, eubacteria. They're also considered, like I said, some of the oldest living organisms, and that is because they can live in very harsh environments, okay? They can live in super hot environments like the inside of a volcano or the deep sea vents on the ocean floor. They can live in very salty environments, which we normally would create a, which normally would create, salty would normally create a hypertonic solution. Okay, they can also survive very acidic conditions like the intestines of mammals, or even alkaline habitats like a hot sulfur spring. They're very hot, and then the sulfur creates, I believe, an alkaline environment. Anyway, these bacteria can be either autotrophs or heterotrophs. Okay, so sometimes they can make their own food, and other species are heterotrophs. They eat things. Okay, and you can tell that all archaebacteria are related based on their RNA. Okay, so they can look at the nucleotide sequences of their RNA and tell they are archaebacteria. So here are some examples of where you could find archaebacteria. So here we have a deep sea vent, okay, in the ocean, and then inside of a volcano. Kingdoms archaebacteria and eubacteria are sometimes referred to as Monera. Okay, so eubacteria, eu means true. Okay, do not confuse that with eukaryotic. Eukaryotic, EU is true, karyo is nucleus. Eukaryotic cells have a true nucleus. Eubacteria are true bacteria. Okay, and so this is what are going to be our common bacteria, like the bacteria that make you sick, for example. Okay, so these bacteria are going to have a cell wall with peptidoglycan. Okay, so that's a major difference between eubacteria and archaebacteria. They are also going to be classified based on their shape, if they need oxygen or not, what their cell wall is like, their disease-causing ability, and how they react to gram staining. Okay, so like staining to put on a microscope slide. Now, these bacteria might be autotrophs, they might be heterotrophs, they might be decomposers, or even parasites. So, just to review, autotrophs, you have photosynthetic autotrophs, and then you have something called chemosynthetic autotrophs. We did a whole unit on photosynthesis. I think we all understand that photosynthetic autotrophs are going to contain chlorophyll. And so the chlorophyll is going to gather the sun's energy to make food through photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria are an example of that. Now then you have chemosynthetic autotrophs. These are bacteria or autotrophs that use chemicals like nitrogen and sulfur. They break them down and then remake the organic compound glucose. Okay, so a lot of times the bacteria living in a deep sea vent, volcanic vent, there's no photosynthesis, so these will be the base of the food chain. Okay, they would create their own food through chemosynthesis. All bacteria, remember, they're prokaryotic, so they lack or do not have a nucleus. Okay, so here's some pictures of some bacteria. Okay, so pros and cons. Most people, they think of bacteria as bad, but not all bacteria are bad. In fact, some are very necessary for life. Okay, so we're going to talk about those helpful bacteria now. So most bacteria are actually good. They're important and beneficial, and they help with processes. They help make things go better. Okay, so one example of that is nitrogen-fixing bacteria. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria are essential for the nitrogen cycle, which we'll be going over in the next unit. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria live on the roots of plants, and they help the plant get nutrients. So when you fertilize a plant, you're actually fertilizing these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, and then those bacteria help the plant take in more nutrients. Okay? So another way that bacteria can be beneficial is that they can be decomposers. Okay, so when you die, I'm sure y'all have heard of like murder mysteries and stuff. When you die, your body decomposes. It decomposes because you have bacteria in your body that do that. When a squirrel dies in the woods, same thing. Whatever doesn't get eaten by another animal gets decomposed. Okay, so they break down dead things. Other bacteria put oxygen into the soil. There are lots of little things that live in the soil. For example, earthworms. They live in the soil, so they have to get oxygen. And so some bacteria put oxygen in the soil through photosynthesis. And then some bacteria are used to make different foods, like pickles, yogurt, cheeses like blue cheese. Okay. Many bacteria can kill other bad bacteria. So many bacteria are antibiotics. Remember, antibio means against life. Okay, so these are just things that kill other living things. So there are some bacteria that can do that. Neomycin and erythromycin are examples of this. So if you've ever used Neosporin on a cut, then you've used this. Probiotics is something you've probably heard of before. This is commonly found in like yogurt. So probiotics live naturally in your intestines. Probiotics are very important for your digestive system. They actually recommend, if you've taken an antibiotic, to take a probiotic with it or after you take it so that you can replenish the good bacteria, because some antibiotics will kill both the good and bad bacteria in your body. So that's why they say like to eat yogurt if you are taking antibiotics. Anyway, so they live in your intestines. They help your body make vitamins, absorb nutrients, and they also help your immune system because they can possibly kill bad bacteria. So here's some examples of things I could find, places I could find good bacteria. Okay, so that brings us to bad bacteria. So I think a lot of us already have a general idea of where bad bacteria come from. This is one reason why we have to wash our hands, not just because of viruses like coronavirus. We also have to be aware of bacteria. Okay, so one thing is endospores. You have something called endospores. And so those spores are bacteria that can cause things like the botulism or tetanus, why you get a tetanus shot. There's some bacteria that cause Lyme disease. So you get that from a tick bite. The tick introduces bacteria into when it bites you. Strep throat, very common. Strep throat is a bacteria, Streptococcus aureus. You naturally have strep bacteria in some places in your body, but some places it should not be. So if it goes there, then it can cause problems. Biofilms is what we call bacteria that cause cavities. This is why you have to physically brush your teeth is to get all the biofilms off, including flossing to get where the toothbrush can't get. So that brings us to kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista is known as the catch-all kingdom because if it's not a bacteria and it's eukaryotic and it's not a plant, animal, or fungus, then it goes into Protista. So that makes this the most diverse kingdom. It has the most different organisms within this one particular kingdom. So it's called catch-all because if it doesn't fit in another kingdom, it goes here. Now, all protists are eukaryotic, so they're going to have nucleus, they're going to have membrane-bound organelles. But because they're so diverse, they might be auto or heterotrophs. They might be uni or multicellular. They might be big or small, okay? But one thing that a lot of protists have in common is that they live in water, okay? Usually they live in fresh water. So many of them have an organelle called a contractile vacuole. Okay, a contractile vacuole is like a normal vacuole. Okay, it's going to store water and stuff. Okay, but because it lives in fresh water, remember hypotonic automatically is going to cause the cell to swell. Well, because of that, they live in fresh water. These things have contractile vacuoles. So they contract if they get too much stored water, and that releases the extra water. So it pumps out, it squeezes, it contracts extra water out so that the cell does not become hypotonic, swell, and burst, because they do live in fresh water, and we know fresh water, pure water, is pretty much always going to be a hypotonic solution to any cell. So here's a few examples of some protists. Notice the water here being stored. Got a vacuole here. I can't really see the one in this other picture, but here's just some unicellular protists, and they live in water. This is an amoeba up here, and I know it's an amoeba because it's shapeless. Notice how this has a distinctive shape, this has a distinctive shape, even though it's weird. This does not have a distinctive shape. It's kind of all over the place. So amoebas are known for that. Amoebas are protists. So you have three types of protists. They're either plant-like, animal-like, or fungus-like. Remember how I said they're all eukaryotic, and your eukaryotic kingdoms are animal, plant, fungi, protist. Well, if it doesn't go in animal, plant, or fungi, then it's going to go in protist, and it's either going to be animal-like, plant-like, or fungus-like. So again, these are usually going to be unicellular. Now, animal-like protists are also called protozoans. So one example of that is a paramecium. We did mention about paramecium, how they can go through fragmentation, where if you cut them any which way, they can grow into a brand new paramecium. Again, amoeba. Amoebas are a very common protist that we talk about. They do not have a cell wall. They are shapeless. They have pseudopods. They're very special because they have pseudopods that stick out of the cytoplasm. Remember, pseudopod is a false foot. Okay, so most other protists are going to have cilia or flagella to help them move, but amoeba are special because they have those pseudopods. Most or a lot of protozoans are parasitic, and they might cause different diseases. One example of that is malaria. Paramecia take in and expel water with what? That's going to be contractile vacuoles. Stores the water and then it contracts and expels it as needed. Okay, so plant-like protists. Well, they're plant-like because they contain chlorophyll and they go through photosynthesis, which makes them autotrophs. Okay, algae is a major example of plant-like protists. A lot of people think algae is a plant because it's green. Well, not all algae is green, but anyway. They have those pigments to go through photosynthesis. So algae are not considered a plant because they do not have any of the organs required for it to be a plant. Plants have 4 organs, if you remember: root, stem, leaf, and flower. Okay, and because algae have none of this, they are not considered a plant. Now, many algae are green, but some may be also red, brown, or gold, and they can still do photosynthesis with those pigments. Anyway, algae might be one cell, unicellular, or up to a mile long. Okay, so this is red algae. If you've ever heard of a red tide, that is red algae. This is green algae in a petri dish. And this will be a large amount of algae in a river. So another example of a plant-like protist, and one of my favorites, is diatoms. Diatoms are just really beautiful. I mean, they're unicellular. I can't see them with my just basic eyes. I'd have to look under a microscope, but they're just really cool. Diatoms have a glass-like shell. Okay, and again, they're microscopic, unicellular, and when they die, the glass shell sinks to the bottom of the water that it's in, and these are usually found in fresh water most of the time. Anyway, and so eventually you get all these dead diatoms on the bottom, and so that's called dichotomous earth. Okay, and so it's used in abrasive things that are grainy. Like think about a face wash that's real grainy that helps you like exfoliate. That probably has diatoms in it. Or toothpaste. Toothpaste is kind of grainy. It can even be used in bug spray or insecticides, certain insecticides. It's not bug spray, but certain like the kind of powdery ones. Anyway, so I have a picture of diatoms for you coming up in just a second, and you'll see what I'm talking about. They're really cool. If you've ever noticed how some sand is shiny and some sand is not shiny, that shininess in the sand, you're seeing diatoms in it. If there's no shininess, then diatoms are probably not present. Some other examples of plant-like protists are going to be euglenoids, golden, green, brown, red algae. So this is a picture of the diatoms, and notice the glass-like shell, and I just think they're cool. Then you have fungus-like protists. Fungus-like protists, they are considered fungus-like protists because they're usually decomposers. They also are able to move somehow for part of their life. This is going to include very specific types of mold and mildew. Okay, most mold and mildew is a fungus, but these particular types are fungus-like protists, and that includes slime molds, downy mildews, and water molds. Okay, and so these are decomposers, so they decompose dead things. That brings us to kingdom fungi. Now, fungi, one of the main characteristics of fungi is they grow anywhere that has moisture or water, okay, or dampness. They have to have moisture in order to thrive, okay? So fungi are going to be almost all multicellular except for yeast. Yeast is a fungi. And they are the only unicellular fungi. So the yeast in your yeast bread is fungi. Anyway, so fungi used to be classified as plants, but because they do not have chlorophyll, they do not go through photosynthesis, and they are not autotrophs, they are not producers, they are not plants. They are actually consumers. They consume, they eat. Okay, they decompose dead things, and that's what they eat. So they eat. They're consumers. Another word for a consumer is a heterotroph. So they are heterotrophs. They depend on other organisms for energy. They cannot make their own food like a plant can. Which of these groups is made up of entirely consumers? Okay, that's going to be fungi, like we just talked about. Okay, so here are some pictures of some mushrooms. That one looks like Toad off of Mario. That's just another cool, pretty mushroom. So fungi are very unique because they use extracellular digestion to eat. Okay, what that means is they digest it first, okay, and then they take it in or absorb it. Okay, so we as humans, we eat our food first, then we digest it. Fungi, they digest it first, then they take it in, then they eat it. Okay, and remember, they are consumers. They consume, they have to eat. Okay, so what they do is, excuse my drawing. Okay, here's some rotten leaves. Okay. All right. Here's my mushroom. Oh, that's like a tree. Hang on. I'll just do it like that. There's my mushroom, okay? And so what's going to happen is the mushroom or the fungi is going to have these little hyphae that come out. Now, these are going to be microscopic. You can't see them. But they're going to go out into the food source. They kind of are like tentacles almost, okay? And they go out in the food source, and they're going to release digestive juices, the digestive enzymes, and they're going to break down those leaves until the leaves are small enough to cross into the cell walls of the hyphae. And then once they're small enough, then they take it in and absorb it. So the Fungi use extracellular digestion. They digest it first, then they take it in, and they absorb it. Now, another significant characteristic about fungi is that their cell wall is made of chitin. Okay, remember, plant cell walls are made of cellulose. Fungi cell wall is made of chitin. Okay, both cellulose and chitin are chitin, chitin, however you want to say it, however you can remember it. You're not going to have to say it on your state test. But anyway, so both of these are cellulose and chitin are a polysaccharide. Okay, remember that means mini sugar, which is a carbohydrate. Which of the following distinguishes the organisms in kingdom fungi from other eukaryotic organisms? Well, hopefully you recall that fungi obtain nutrients through absorption, specifically extracellular digestion. Okay, so fungi, heterotrophs. Remember, they are consumers. Okay, so usually fungi are going to be decomposers. A decomposer breaks down dead and decaying matter. So it was alive at one point. Now, there is one type of decomposer called a saprophyte, and that is like a mushroom. Okay, so it breaks down dead matter. Fungi may also be parasites. Ringworm, athlete's foot, both of those are funguses, and they are parasitic funguses. Another example of a fungus is actually a fungus and an algae, which is a protist. Okay, this is a mutualistic relationship between a fungus and algae, a protist. And so it's called a lichen. Okay, so lichens grow on the side of rocks, and they break down the rock into soil. So if you've ever seen some kind of green looking stuff growing on a rock, it's probably a lichen, and it's breaking and very slowly going to break down that rock into soil. And that's one way you could get soil. Eventually, the plants will grow in that soil. Okay, so here's a few examples of fungi. So you have your ringworm. This is just a fungus. And then you have a lichen on the rock. Okay, so reproduction in fungi. So fungi can reproduce a couple different ways. So typically, fungi are going to reproduce asexually, not always, but like yeast reproduces through budding. Remember, that's when a new organism grows off from the parent and breaks off or divides and pinches off. They can also go through fission, similar to binary fission, where the yeast splits in half and makes two new yeast. And then they can also, many mushrooms reproduce sexually. If you've ever kicked a mushroom and the powder comes out, you are releasing sex cells. And those sex cells are going to be called spores, okay, or basidiospores. So they're produced in the cap. So when you kick that mushroom over, you think you're getting rid of it, and you release all this mushroom powder, you're helping that mushroom release its sex cells to be fertilized. Okay, so those spores are produced through meiosis. So they are haploid, so two of the spores have to meet in order to be fertilized and germinate, okay, to have the baby mushroom. So here's an example of budding in yeast. See, the new one is breaking off from the original parent, so that will be asexual. Remember, budding is asexual. And then here we have spores being released. Those spores were produced through meiosis, and so that would be sexual. So some fungi can reproduce both sexually and asexually, okay? And that depends on the conditions that the fungi is in. Bread mold and many fungi are going to, or have the capability of reproducing both ways. Okay, so if you see the word sporangium, those are how fungi produce asexual spores. And so they're going to produce genetically identical copies. And those sporangium can release spores, then those spores just grow into more sporangia. Okay, now, usually these fungi are going to reproduce asexually if they have favorable conditions. Remember, favorable for mushrooms is going to have moisture, like having water. or damp conditions. If conditions are unfavorable, then they're going to reproduce sexually. Okay, so how fungi reproduce sexually is they have these hyphae similar to the ones they digest with, and the two different hyphae, which are haploid, are going to connect to form what's called a zygospore. So just like humans make a zygote, they make a zygospore. Okay, and like I said, conditions are not favorable. They don't have moisture, so that zygospore has to wait. It's dormant until you get favorable conditions, which is going to be moisture for germination. So that might be where you don't see mushrooms for a while, and then it rains, and then all of a sudden you see mushrooms. That's because those zygospores were dormant until the moisture came back. So this is just a picture of sporangium and spores on bread mold. Okay, so fungi can be good or bad. There's some benefits, some are harmful. We mentioned some of them. So beneficial fungi are, of course, going to be some of the foods we eat, like we eat mushrooms. Supposedly they're healthy. Yeast, I sure like yeast rolls, so yeast make bread. Remember, alcoholic fermentation, so alcohols are made through yeast cells. Cheese, some cheeses are made from funguses. Some medicines are made from funguses. Penicillin is a very common antibiotic that is made from fungi, and it kills bacteria infections. Remember, antibiotics will not kill viruses. Fungi may also be harmful. Some fungi can get on crops, maybe on strawberries or lettuce or timber, and destroy them. There's a plant disease called the rust and smuts. That is a fungi. And if you live near the coast here, you've heard of black mold. Black mold is a fungi, that can occur after you get water damage in your house, for example, after a hurricane. And black mold is very dangerous because not only does it destroy that part of your house or whatever, like the sheetrock or whatever, but if you inhale it, it can cause you to have a lung infection that can kill you. So with black mold or any kind of mold, and you don't know if it's black mold or not, you're supposed to always wear like mask and stuff to protect yourself.